Your Excellencies, distinguished United Nations experts, esteemed judges and jurists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Azadeh. I'm a lawyer from London as well as a very proud representative of JVMI, that is Justice for the Victims of the 1988 massacre in Iran. Allow me at the outset to take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude to President-elect Mrs. Maryam Rajavi for her incredibly moving and powerful and incisive opening remarks to this conference. It is important to note that it was under Mrs. Rajavi's leadership that the Iranian resistance tirelessly campaigned for justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre. And in fact, they have worked tirelessly to continuously bring the file of the 1988 massacre to human rights organizations around the world and to make it part of international human rights discussion and discourse. Very much our hope, ladies and gentlemen, that by the conclusion of today's conference, we will have identified specific actionable recommendations and mechanisms that may be pursued for accountability for the families. These mechanisms are not only absolutely essential in order to bring the perpetrators of these rights violations to account for their crimes, but also it's vitally important in order to honor the memory of the victims of the massacre and also their legacy, and also, of course, it's vitally important for the families. Many of the families, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, have very much honored us with their presence here this afternoon, and I thank them.
I, Chile Ebo Suji, solemnly undertake that I will perform my duties and exercise my powers as a judge of International Criminal Court.
پروفسور ابو اوسوجی، رئیس دیوان بین المللی جنایی تا سال 2021. حقوق بین الملل این ایده را به رسمیت نمی شناسد که کسی به خاطر مقامش در هر دولتی مسئولیت داشته باشد. از این رو افرادی که جنایات یا فجایعی را مرتکب می شوند و فکر می کنند که به خاطر مقامشان محافظت می شوند، اشتباه محاسبه بزرگی می کنند.
یکی از نکات مهمی که جاوید رحمان در گزارش اخیر خود مطرح کرده این است که آنچه در سال 1367 رخ داد نسل کشی است. این تحلیل بسیار معقول و معتبری است.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. The conference, the theme of the conference is Iran, accountability for atrocity crimes. And in the subtext of the conference theme, we see also a repeat of the word accountability and also time to end impunity. Now, on the 20th of November 1918, that's 106 years ago, after the end of the First World War, there was a meeting being held in the cabinet of the British government. The Prime Minister of the UK at the time, David Lloyd George, was presiding over the meeting. And an agenda for discussion was what to do about accountability. Many people around the world, especially in Europe that was devastated by the First World War, wanted accountability. Specifically, they wanted to try the Kaiser, the German emperor, an all-powerful man at the time. Certainly before the First World War, he was one of the world's most powerful men, certainly continental Europe's most powerful man. So the question was, well, David Lloyd George's government, as well as the government of France, led then by Premier Georges Clemenceau, wanted to have him prosecuted. But there was no precedent in international law for holding world leaders accountable for atrocity crimes at the time, let alone setting up an international tribunal to do the trial. So the question that David Lloyd George and his cabinet colleagues were debating was what to do. We do want this thing to happen, but there is no international law that supports the proposition. In the meantime, in France, the same conversation was happening, and David Lloyd George was told in his cabinet that that discussion was happening in France, in Paris, and that the Premier Clemenceau said, yes, I want to see the Kaiser tried. Remember, the significance of the Kaiser here was a head of state, the most powerful man in Europe at the time. We want to see him tried, said Clemenceau, but because we are not sure what international law position is on it, Clemenceau said, I have tasked some leading French experts to study the question. So that was the report that was given to the cabinet of David Lloyd George on the 20th of November 1918. Lloyd George said, well, I too want to see the Kaiser tried. About international law, we are making international law. And all we want is that it serves the needs of justice. The significance of that, you may be wondering, why is he telling this story? The significance of that is in we are making international law, and we want to see it serve the needs of justice. The point was that it was leaders of states that made international law. That was what David Lloyd George was saying. And he signaled from then on that he, from England, and Clemenceau from France, were determined to change international law so that leaders of states, the most powerful leaders of states, can be held accountable when they are accused of international crimes. And they'll be held accountable before a judicial inquiry made up of a panel of independent judges who will review the evidence and decide whether or not the accused person was guilty of a crime as charged. Now, it's timely that we are holding this conference today because in 7 weeks, there's a book I've written on this subject. As I said, it's timely. I didn't plan my book to have this conference and talk about the book. But in 7 weeks, there's a book I've written on it called End of Immunity that we published, End of Immunity. And I tell the story of It's on there. I tell that story in how it is that international law from 1919 till now has changed so as to say international law no longer recognizes the idea that anybody is above the law because they are heads of state. That debate happened, as I said, it was a non-starter of a discussion before 1918. You didn't even talk about it. It was off the table for discussion. But from 1918, 1919, two heads of government, one in the UK and one in France, decided to change that story. And that story was effectively changed when, at the end of the Second World War, we had trials, were called the Nuremberg trials. And we had a document that's called the Charter of Nuremberg, basically the instrument under which the Nuremberg Tribunal was organized. That instrument, the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal, in Article 7, made it clear that heads of state no longer enjoyed immunity. The people will be held accountable. And on the basis of that, we had the Nuremberg Tribunal that tried all the surviving leaders of the Third Reich, of the Nazi regime. All of them were tried. No, the essence of what I said, all the surviving leaders, was because Hitler committed suicide just as the war was ending. But the organization to try all the surviving leaders had him in mind as the first person to be tried. But he couldn't be tried because he committed suicide. What did the Nuremberg Tribunal do next? They tried Grand Admiral Dönitz. Dönitz was the guy who took over as head of state of Germany from Hitler after Hitler committed suicide. Dönitz was tried by the Nuremberg Tribunal. In other words, the head of state tried, and everybody else tried. So the point of that is that was the beginning of the story of the end of immunity for heads of state, for leaders of government. The same trial happened in the Far East, in Tokyo, where, again, with the exception of the emperor of Japan during the war, Emperor Hirohito, who was the only one not tried, all the surviving leadership of the Japanese imperial cabinet during the war were put to trial and tried for war crimes that were held accountable for. So again, that is the beginning of the end, in essence, of immunity. And the Rwanda Tribunal, where I worked as a prosecutor, also tried everybody, senior leaders of that government. I happen to have had honor of being a trial team leader of Colonel Bagasora. Colonel Bagasora was the gentleman who was effective leader of Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. He was put on trial. So was the Prime Minister of Rwanda at the time. You also know the story of the leader of Serbia, Milosevic, who was also tried. You know the story of Charles Taylor, the president of Liberia, who was tried before the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So the point I make with that is, as of today, as we are standing here, international law does not recognize that anybody enjoys immunity because of the position they hold in any government, be that president, prime minister, or whatever. So people who commit crimes or atrocities, thinking that they are protected by their office are making a very serious miscalculation in that regard. The second point I'd like to make is the idea of a debate that we also hear in the corridors of international law, international relations. That has to do with when you have a tribunal that has been set up under a treaty, an international agreement, some people tend to think, well, because we are not party to that treaty, that international agreement that set up this tribunal, because we are not a party to it, we did not sign it, what they do does not concern us, they cannot exercise jurisdiction over us. Again, that is a very, very serious mistake for anybody to make. I cannot begin to explain the nitty-gritty, the details of international law that makes it a serious mistake, but I can say this for now. In relation to the ICC, for example, specifically, that debate comes up a lot. Now, one short circuit, one way to get to the conclusions I'm trying to get at here is this. The ICC is made up of 124 states parties, including all of Europe, Western Europe in particular, as well as most of Eastern Europe. We know that France is a prominent member of the ICC. Albania is a member of the ICC. Why is this important? Why do I talk about Albania? Why do I talk about France? Some of you might already have figured it out, because this is where some of the activists of the MEK, PMOI are, where they live. Now, the construct of international law, and the Rome Statute in particular, gives ICC jurisdiction over crimes that happen on member states of the Rome Statute. So if an international crime against humanity is committed in Albania, ICC would have jurisdiction if Albania doesn't prosecute or investigate. If a crime against humanity is committed in France, ICC would have jurisdiction if France doesn't prosecute or investigate. The point then becomes any attack or violation of rights of the members of MEK in those countries, to the point that the violation amounts to international criminal law, international crime, will be subject, something that the ICC will have jurisdiction over. So that's the second point I want to make. The third point, and I'll leave you, is Professor Rehman has done a magnificent job in his tenure as the special rapporteur. As was observed earlier, he had lifted the veil of silence on the discussion around what happened in 1988 in Iran and later. And his research and his writings, his reports, have now given members of the international community the authority, the license to discuss these questions and what needs to be done about them. So he deserves credit for that, and I give it to him. One of the points he makes in his last report, on which some scholars will get into an argument about, and I'll give you in a minute what that is, where he said that what happened in 1988 can be characterized as genocide. My own view on the matter is that that is a very reasonable and credible analysis to make. It is possible to characterize that event as a genocide. So I thank you and leave you.